fabulous job. Uh, that's nice to know. We're now recording. Okay. Um, Elise joined us a couple of years ago. I was fascinated. I did not know, and she put in the newsletter that she's a member of the ministry, and I'd love to hear about that. But I know she's a teacher because that's the reason she'll be gone next month. She'll be in Nashville teaching a course. She's also taught an Ollie course, and I think is scheduled to do another one uh, sometime soon for Tucson. So anyway, probably most of us, I don't think, really realized the Native American involvement in the Civil War. We heard about the Irish, we've heard about the Zouaves. We know that the African Americans got involved late, but I was not aware that there was as big a participation on both sides from the Native Americans. And Elise Moore is going to tell us about that. So Elise, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Gene. And I'm delighted that all of you are decided to, come in and join us for this particular talk. I know sort of early in the year here in September. So I'm going to just dive right into this topic because, believe it or not, there is a lot to say. So I'm going to start off with, there were actually 28,693 Native Americans who served in the Civil War for either the Confederacy or for the Union. And of course, I counted every one of them. So I know that's such an accurate number. Anyway, men from at least 20 tribes fought in the Civil War, including men from the 5 civilized tribes, which are the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. These tribes were removed from Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida during the Indian removals from about 1830 to 1847. And most of the men of these tribes fought on the side of the Confederacy. And we'll talk more about them later. The Iroquois Confederacy or nation in upstate New York included 6 nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. And they all fought for the Union. But I want to start with some lesser known tribes before we talk about sort of the big ones that everyone might know about. So the Kickapoo fought for the Confederacy. This was their one battle and they won it. So I guess they took their chips and went home. The Osage was split between the Confederacy and the Union, but most of them fought for the Confederacy. The Osage Battalion was comprised of 4 companies, totaling 200 men. It was eventually transferred under the command of the Cherokee Brigadier General Stand Watie under his 1st Indian Brigade. And we'll definitely talk more about Stand Watie later on. The Osage became the only Native American tribe outside of the 5 civilized tribes to join the Confederacy in any significant number. This is a photo of Osage Company leaders, including on the far left is Osage Battalion Captain Young Black Dog. He was the son of the Osage chief Black Dog. The Osage Battalion fought at the Second Battle of Cabin Creek, where the Confederates captured 130 wagons, more than 1,800 horses and mules from a Union supply train. So that was a big win for them. Then we have the Shawnee. They were split into several small groups. The Loyal Shawnee, as they were called, fought for the Union. And that's about all you can say for them. They were a small group and in with other non-Native American fighting units. The Lumbee were a small band of natives there in North Carolina. The North Carolinians categorized them as free men of color. And they were forced into forced labor to build Fort Fisher near Wilmington, North Carolina. when one of the families of the Lumbee, a family named Lowry, the men of that family were assassinated by the Confederates, all except the youngest son, who was named Henry. Henry survived this assassination and formed the Lumbee Band. They fought in support of the Union, but never under the Union. They actually fought after the Civil War in North Carolina. And by 1872, they had achieved mythic status in the area where they were operating, until suddenly Henry Lowry, their leader, disappeared. That does not mean he was killed. It just means he might have gotten tired of all this and decided to have a new identity, which he could not do in North Carolina because they had killed over 18 men and done associated other deeds in North Carolina. And so he just disappeared, probably somewhere out west, and his band disbanded. Okay, then we have the Catawba. Now, the Catawba lived in South Carolina for over 10,000 years. There was a long history there of persecution and enslavement. They were originally enslaved by white plantation owners when they first moved to South Carolina before the importation of Black slaves. They were defeated in battles and so forth until by 1860, the Catawba tribe numbered in total 55 men, women, and children. But when South Carolina seceded, 20 of the Catawba Indians, the men, enlisted in the South Carolina infantry. And in 1861, Captain Cadwallader Jones of the 1st North Carolina Cavalry Regiment created a company known as the Indian Land Guards. And that company was later assigned to the 12th South Carolina Infantry. Jones's company of Indians included the Catawbas. They served in the Peninsula Campaign, the Second Battle of Bull Run, Antietam, and at the Siege of Petersburg. A couple of Catawba Indians also ended up sprinkled through some of the other South Carolina infantry, but with only 20 of them, they were not in a large number. Anyway, enough Catawbas survived the war that now they have a population of 2,800 Catawba Indians and their own reservation in Rock Hill, South Carolina. So this is the one Indian tribe that actually gained something out of the Civil War and came out on top. And pretty much it's the only Indian tribe that came out in a positive manner after the Civil War. So then we have a group of Cherokee. Now this is the Eastern Cherokee. You can actually still visit the Eastern Cherokee. They're in the Appalachian Mountains, sort of crossing the border in North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia. They're sort of not defined by state borders. Anyway, during the Civil War, Colonel William Holland Thomas, who was a white merchant, formed the Thomas Legion. He had, with his own money, purchased land for the Eastern Cherokees who had avoided the removals by hiding in the Appalachian Mountains. So he had purchased land for them and settled them on this private land. So basically the government couldn't get to them. When the Civil War came, William Thomas formed a fighting force from these Eastern Cherokee and some other mountain men on the side of the Confederacy. 200 Cherokee formed the Junaluska Zouaves, named after Chief Junaluska, who had died in 1858. He was chief of that Eastern Cherokee group. So you might hear about the Thomas Legion, you might hear about the Junaluska Zouaves. They are the same group, just different names. And here's a picture of some of these gentlemen at a reunion numbers of years after the Civil War. But while we're looking at this picture, the question is, why did any of these Native Americans involve themselves in the Civil War? They were not citizens in the Union. They wouldn't become citizens until 1924, long after Black men and women became citizens. So they couldn't vote. In fact, Indians in North Dakota could not vote until 1958. And to be honest, Indians in Arizona, there were some Indian groups who were not finding it possible to vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So Indians certainly weren't being motivated to fight in the Civil War by civil rights. Some were motivated by money. They were being hired as substitutes in the North, or they wanted the monetary incentives offered by the Union later in the war. Some fought with the promise of a separate Indian state. And that is what the Confederacy promised those in Indian Territory. So that was a big motivator for the 5 civilized tribes. Some Indian tribes were in the process of negotiating with the federal government to gain back their original lands or to protect land that they now occupied. And they thought that fighting in the war would further their cause. By the way, it did not further their cause. Some fought to protect their families and property because the war had come to them. And that was definitely true for Indians in the South. The Union had withdrawn soldiers protecting various tribes in Indian Territory from white incursions. And so the Cherokee and other tribes felt that it was necessary to arm themselves and fight to defend their land and their families. And on the flip side, some Indian groups, like the Delaware, which we'll talk about in a moment, they felt it necessary to arm and fight because other Indian tribes, like the Cherokees, were intruding in their area, their territory, and the federal government was not defending them. So there was a need for them to take up arms. But regardless of the motivation, one thing is certain: after the war, whatever the motivation was, or their hopes and dreams were, they were all shattered. No one except the Catawba gained anything by their participation in the Civil War. So let's get back to these various tribes in the Civil War. I'm not going to address in this talk anything that was happening in the far west. The farthest west I'm going to go is the Trans-Mississippi area. I'm not going to talk about the Plains Indians or Texas. Definitely there were things happening there that were related to the Civil War, but can't do that in this hour. So we're just going to talk about the stories of some of the Indians fighting in the Trans-Mississippi theater and the Eastern theaters. So I want to start with the Delaware Nation. The Delaware Nation had a long history of allegiance to the United States government. On October 1st, 1861, the Delaware proclaimed their support for the Union. And they were actually seeking favor from Washington for some things they wanted to negotiate. So 170 Delaware out of 201 Delaware men volunteered for the Union Army. They were armed with tomahawks, scalping knives, and their own rifles. One Lenape Indian from the Delaware Nation was Black Beaver. Black Beaver had served previously as a scout. He could speak English, French, Spanish, and about 8 different Indian languages. He could also use Plains Indian Sign Language. In 1834, he had raised a company of Delaware and Shawnee Indians, officially known as the Black Beaver's Spy Company. And he raised them for the Texas Mounted Volunteers. He was captain of this company in the Mexican-American War. By 1861, Black Beaver was now a chief of the Delaware tribe. He enlisted on the Union side. He acted as a Native American dignitary and scout. Just a few days after Fort Sumter, Colonel William Emory, who was commander of the Union forces in Indian Territory, began to fear attacks from Arkansas and Texas secessionists. So Colonel Emory withdrew all his troops from the Texas border and from Fort Smith in Arkansas and concentrated them at Fort Cobb in what is now Cato County, Oklahoma. Black Beaver warned Colonel Emory that secessionist troops were approaching Fort Cobb, and Emory was able to capture their advance guard. It's believed that these were the first prisoners captured by the Union in the Civil War. I don't know that that's true, but that's what I heard. Then Black Beaver guided all the Union troops that had gathered at Fort Cobb and their prisoners 500 miles through hostile Confederate-held territory from Fort Cobb to Fort Leavenworth. Now, Fort Leavenworth, if you see where Kansas City is on this map, and if you can see that little jog in the river just north, slightly west of Kansas City, in that little question mark of the river, that's where Fort Leavenworth was located. So Black Beaver guided them this 500 miles. They didn't lose a man, a horse, or a wagon. Black Beaver had been semi-retired. He was quite comfortable before the war. And according to the Indian agent, Black Beaver had the most substantial house and farm on the Delaware Reservation. He had a double log house with 2 fireplaces and 2 shed rooms in the rear and a porch in the front. He had a field of 41.5 acres with 36.5 under cultivation. In retaliation for Black Beaver's assisting the Union Army, specifically in this move, Confederate soldiers seized Black Beaver's cattle and burned his farm to the ground. The Confederates also put a contract on his head, which meant that he could not return home until after the war had ended. Of those 170 Delaware Indians that went into battle under the command of Black Beaver and another Lenape Indian, Captain Fallleaf, they sacked the Wichita Agency in October 1862, which was considered a Union victory. The Native American cavalrymen killed 5 Confederate agents, took the rebel flag and $1,200 in Confederate currency, 100 horses, and burned the agency buildings to the ground. After the war, Black Beaver petitioned the US government to compensate him for the loss of his home and farm. No compensation was given to him or his heirs to this day, although he had been promised compensation by the government. Black Beaver died in 1880 at age 74, and he had become a Baptist minister. Next, let's look at a company of Indian sharpshooters fighting for the Union. This is Company K, 1st Michigan Sharpshooters. In 1863, the Union Army enlisted Native Americans from the Ottawa, Ojibwe, Chippewa, Potawatomi, and a few other northern tribes to form Company K, which was sent to join the Army of the Potomac in time for the Overland Campaign in 1864. They also participated in the Battle of the Crater at Petersburg in July of '64, as well as the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and other battles. Company K was the largest all-Indian regiment in the Union Army east of the Mississippi. The Company K Indian sharpshooters were elite marksmen. They were well-trained, quick, silent, and deadly. They could hit a mark at 600 yards. Company K had 146 men, of which 139 were Anishinaabe, which meant people of the Great Lakes, comprising of those tribes that I mentioned. So that was the majority. They just had a handful, 7 Native Americans from other areas. Now, somehow, those tribes in the north, in Michigan, had managed to avoid Andrew Jackson's Removal and Relocation Act in the 1830s, but they had been forced into signing treaties which ceded millions of acres of their land to whites. By the time of the Civil War, these tribes were trying to renegotiate those treaties, and it's possible that they believed that serving in the Union Army would further their cause. It did not. But at least they did receive the same pay while they were serving in the Army, the same pay as white soldiers received. And that included a $50 state bonus from Michigan, a $25 federal bounty, and $13 per month pay. Now, these tribes were also strongly anti-slavery because they believed that if the Confederacy won, they would be enslaved and treated like the black men. Actually, these tribes of the Great Lakes tried to enlist at the beginning of the war in 1861, and they were rejected, and a law was passed in Michigan that made it illegal for any Indian to be in the military. But by 1863, the Union had lost so many men, and they were so desperate for men that they agreed to admit Native Americans. The first battle of Company K was the Battle of the Wilderness. The Indians immediately realized that their blue uniforms stood out and made them targets in the forest and on the battlefield, while the Confederate butter-colored uniforms blended into the background. So these Indians would find a dry spot of earth and roll in it until their uniform was the color of the ground. And if the day was wet, they would not hesitate to take mud, rub it all over their clothes until they were the color of the earth. And this custom was adopted by the entire regiment in which Company K was a part. And it was often remarked that this regiment of the Michigan group could do the closest skirmishing at the least cost of any regiment in the division. Now, one of the Company K sergeants, those are the tribes there involved in the Company K Indian sharpshooters. So one of the Company K sergeants was Sergeant Cachetigo. He was called Big Tom by the white sharpshooters. And he also, besides rolling in the dirt, he also ordered each of the Indian sharpshooters to cover his breast and head, I'm reading this, breast and head with twigs and leaves. And they went on to do that. Big Tom went on to become one of the best sharpshooters in the Civil War. He was looked up to by his peers, admired and respected by his superior officers. He participated in the Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor, and the capture of Petersburg, among several others. He was wounded twice. And he was mustered out on July 28, 1865, with an honorable discharge. So he served a long time. Another one of the sharpshooters of Company K was Daniel Mwakiwana. He was from Petoskey, Michigan. And in the first Battle of the Wilderness, this was the first battle that the sharpshooters were involved in, he killed 32 rebels in that one battle, several of them being Confederate officers. This is according to the Saginaw Enterprise newspaper. During the Battle of the Wilderness, Daniel Mwakiwana was shot 3 times in the right arm, the face, and his left hand. But he continued fighting and shooting. He died of his wounds after the battle. Now, if it's true that this man killed 32 rebels in one battle, it's worth noting that Alvin York, the noted sharpshooter from Tennessee, received the Medal of Honor in World War I for killing 25 men in one battle. No honor of any sort was ever awarded Daniel Mwakiwana for his achievement, and he's been entirely forgotten. During the siege of Petersburg, it was realized that a well-placed Confederate sharpshooter was picking off Union soldiers, and the Indians of Company K were called upon to stop him. A Lieutenant Bowley, who was not associated with Company K, but he wrote later about this incident. And this is from his memoirs. Nearly a mile away stood a high chimney. All day, the Indians watched that chimney and never fired a shot. The sun had gone down. The twilight was deepening when one of the Indians fired. A man was seen to fall from the chimney. He had incautiously exposed a portion of his body, and the Indian sharpshooter had instantly dropped him. 15 Indian sharpshooters were captured in one of the battles at St. Petersburg and sent to Andersonville. Not only were the Confederate guards cruel, but also a group of Union soldiers known as the Raiders preyed on fellow prisoners. The Indian sharpshooters were attacked by the Raiders who wanted their jewelry, but the Indians circled, stood back to back, and cut and slashed at the Raiders until the Raiders retreated. 2 Raiders were killed and several wounded. The Indians were left alone after that. Although of the 15 sharpshooters who were imprisoned in Andersonville, only 7 survived to return home after the war. The only Indian officer in Company K was Lieutenant Garrett Greveret. He was half German and half Ojibwe. He was fluent in French and English, and Ojibwe, but interestingly not German. He recruited his 55-year-old father, Henry, who became a sergeant in Company K, the only non-Indian in Company K. And they fought together, the son as the lieutenant and the father as sergeant. The father, Henry Greveret, was killed at the body of Spotsylvania courthouse in May of 1864. His son, Lieutenant Garrett Greveret, continued on to Petersburg. At Petersburg, the Company K sharpshooters were sheltering behind trees in one of the battles. They poured volley after volley at the Confederates, and above the din of battle could be heard the Indian war whoop ringing out with every volley. They fought until they ran out of ammunition, and then they charged into hand-to-hand combat. When darkness came, Lieutenant Greveret was among 117 wounded sharpshooters. He died 2 weeks later on July 1st. The father and son are buried together at Mackinac Island in Michigan. Company K was also involved in the Battle of the Crater. The sharpshooters ended up being ordered into the crater. Why they thought sharpshooters would work in the crater, I have no clue. But survivors noted that the Indians would pop up momentarily to take a shot, pick off one Confederate, and then instantly drop down to reload. 4 of them died together. It was recorded that they chanted a death song and died in a group. Of the 146 members of Company K, 43 died during the Civil War. When they returned to Michigan, they continued to be harassed by white Americans. White veterans were given land in gratitude for their service, while Indian veterans had their lands stolen. As an example, an Ottawa village where 3 of the Indian veterans lived was burned to the ground by the local sheriff and white settlers. The Ottawa were driven out and their land stolen. Indian veterans of Company K had difficulty getting their military pensions. It took years of petitions. With the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, several tribes in Michigan were able to reestablish their federal status as a sovereign nation and regain some recognition and land. And they believe that Company K's bravery and success in the Civil War was instrumental in their being granted sovereign nation status. And if you're interested a little bit more in this, this was a great book. Now, there were some other Indian groups up north. For example, in Wisconsin, there were 9,000 Indians of various tribes living there, and 600 of them enlisted in the Union Army. They were spread around different groups. 101 Menominee men from Wisconsin fought from the Union. They were at Vicksburg, and they camouflaged themselves with brush and leaves also. So perhaps this was not just Big Tom's innovation. And they provided cover for Union soldiers digging trenches within yards of the Confederate line. Company K of the 37th Regiment in Wisconsin included 71 Menominee men. Menominee sharpshooters were also at the Battle of the Crater. 6 Menominee were killed in action, 5 were captured, and all of them died in prison camps, and 8 were wounded. Now I want to talk about, that's a picture of perhaps Menominee men, but I'm not sure about that. So I want to talk about one more individual Native American from the Union side before we go to the Confederacy. And this is Ely Parker. And he pronounced it Ely, not Eli. He said it would have had an I there. So Parker's grandmother was a white woman captured by the Seneca in the late 1700s. Ely was Seneca. He was one of 7 children. He was born in 1828. His father was successful. His mother was well educated. And Ely Parker was educated primarily at a Baptist school. He became an interpreter at a young age and went to Washington with delegates from the Iroquois Nation when he was about 18. In his travels, Ely Parker met President Franklin Pierce. He became a Freemason at age 19. He met President Polk in 1848 when he was 20. At one point, Ely Parker took a train ride and sat next to Henry Clay and talked with him the entire day. He studied law for 1 year and was able to pass the New York State bar exam when many men needed 2 and 3 years. He practiced law successfully until the state of New York took away his law license because he was not a citizen. Indians were not citizens, remember, until 1924. So then Ely Parker took a job with the Genesee Canal Commission up in New York. He went to a technical school and he became a practical engineer. He was very successful. He rose in the ranks of the canal company until someone fired him because he was an Indian. Now, Ely Parker was obviously an Indian. He was solidly built, barrel-chested, dark-complected. He was silent and an imposing figure. So I think it was just jealousy. But anyway, then the United States Treasury Department hired Ely Parker to be a supervising engineer in Galena, Illinois, to build a custom house, a marine hospital, and a post office. And that's where he met Ulysses S. Grant. They were both Freemasons, by the way. And I don't know who is in the center of this picture, by the way. In Galena, Ely Parker served in the militia and gained some military experience. When the Civil War started, Ely Parker tried to enlist. He was rejected. He appealed directly to the Secretary of War, Seward. Remember, he actually knew presidents and people in the cabinet. He appealed directly to Secretary of War Seward, and Seward told him, quote, "This is a white man's war." However, his brother successfully enlisted in New York. His brother became a sergeant, served with the Tuscarora Indian Company that was stationed near New Bern, North Carolina. Ironically, that was the original land from which the Tuscarora Indian tribe had been removed in the 1700s. Now they were back to defend their original tribal lands, but with the Union Army. Anyway, back to Ely. Ely had a friend and fellow Mason, John C. Smith, who appointed Ely Parker as an adjutant general on his personal staff. Ely was so well organized, so knowledgeable that his friends called him the encyclopedia. On June 26, 1863, Ely Parker went with Colonel John C. Smith, who later became a general, to Vicksburg. And that's when Grant saw him again and recruited him to serve as Grant's personal secretary for the rest of the war. In October 1863, Ely Parker went to Chattanooga with Grant. He was with Grant on Orchard Knob watching the Battle of Missionary Ridge. Everywhere Grant went, Ely was by his side. Grant's handwriting was notoriously terrible, and Ely Parker would write his orders. At some point, Grant made him a brevet brigadier general, and at the surrender at Appomattox, oh, that's a picture of him when he became a brigadier general in his uniform. At the surrender at Appomattox, a Colonel Ted Bowers, another one of Grant's aides, was supposed to write the surrender terms, but his hands were shaking. So Grant asked General Ely Parker to write the surrender. Ely Parker always had steady hands, always spoke in a soft voice. He was deliberate, he was calm. And in this picture, you can see him on the far right seated. That is General Ely Parker. So Brigadier General Ely Parker, chief of the Seneca Nation by that time, lawyer and engineer, drew up the Articles of Surrender, which General Robert E. Lee signed at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. And there's a story that when General Lee was introduced to General Parker, that Lee was startled when he realized that Parker was Indian. But in typical Southern charm, he recovered and said to Parker, "I'm glad to see one real American here." To which General Parker replied, "We are all Americans." After the signing, General Parker went with Grant to Washington. He met and talked with Abraham Lincoln on April 14th, the day before Lincoln was assassinated. After the Civil War, Parker was commissioned as an officer in the 2nd United States Cavalry. He continued as a military secretary to Grant with the rank of colonel during the Johnson administration until Grant was elected president. Then he resigned from the military, and President Grant appointed Ely Parker to be the first Native American Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Commissioner Parker promoted Indian education. He visited tribes in the West. He participated in talks and negotiations. He came to Arizona. Arizona is named in honor of his visit. And there were no Indian wars when Ely Parker was commissioner. He held that position as commissioner of Indian Affairs for about 2 years. And then he was charged by jealous white men of being corrupt when he expedited a shipment of food that was being held up in Philadelphia. The food was destined for Indians on the reservations. Winter was coming, and he knew the food had to be shipped immediately in order to prevent Indians from starving. But for taking action to move that food, he was charged with corruption and tried in the House of Representatives. He was exonerated of all charges and fully supported by Grant. But by this time, he was just tired of all this, and he resigned. Now, that wasn't the only scandal and gossip attached to Ely Parker. In December of 1867, it was announced that Colonel Ely Parker, chief of the Six Nations, was to be married to Minnie Sackett, an 18-year-old white Washington socialite. Now, Ely was 39 at this time. General Grant was going to give the bride away since her father had died in the war, and hundreds of people came to the wedding at a church. Ely had borrowed a military sash from General Grant the day before to wear with his wedding suit. He'd made reservations for their honeymoon trip. But on the day of the wedding, Ely didn't show up. To this day, it is a mystery. It is believed that members of the Seneca tribe visited Ely the night before the wedding and drugged him. They were opposed to the chief of the Seneca Nation marrying a white woman. In fact, it was actually illegal for whites and Indians to marry. Several days, Ely reappeared. The wedding was rescheduled, so obviously Ely's explanation to Minnie was satisfactory. And 3,000 people came to the Episcopal Church for the wedding, only to learn that the couple had married the night before. Let's not have a rerun. The night before, in a private ceremony, General Grant served as Ely's best man, and he also gave away the bride. The devoted couple had one daughter 10 years later when Minnie was 28 and Ely was 50. And they were devoted to one another their entire married life. After leaving Grant's administration, after he resigned as being Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Ely became a successful and wealthy businessman. But he got caught in the same financial reversals that President Grant was caught in. So in 1876, he took a job as a clerk with the New York Police Department at $2,400 a year, which was quite a respectable salary at the time. Later on, he collapsed in his office and he died at home in August of 1896 at the age of 68. His wife, Minnie, never remarried. She died in 1932 at the age of 82. All right, let's turn to some of the stories of the Indians who fought on the side of the Confederacy. Now, the Indian removals of the 1830s are directly related to the rise of slavery in the South, the Southern cotton economy, also called white gold, which was the fundamental reason for the Civil War. The 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and to some degree the Seminole, occupied prime land for agriculture and the growing of cotton. And if you look at where they were, you can see that this is prime cotton raising area. In fact, these Indians grew cotton themselves and were successful planters and plantation owners in their own right. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and Chickasaw owned slaves in the 1820s and 1830s. More than 10% of the Cherokee owned slaves, sort of about the same percentage as white plantation owners in this area later on. John Ross, who became principal chief of the Cherokee, was a large tobacco plantation owner and owned 20 slaves. His brother Lewis owned 14 slaves. Another friend of theirs owned 100 enslaved people. Major Ridge, this is John Ross's house in Tennessee. Well, Tennessee/North Carolina, Georgia. Major Ridge, who was the war chief of the Cherokee back in the 1820s, 1830s, owned 30 enslaved people, and his son John owned 21 enslaved people. The Choctaw chief, Greenwood LaFleur, owned 400 enslaved people. So when the Indians were forced off their land to Indian territory there in the West, they took their slaves with them. The story of the Indians moving to Indian territory is complicated. It involves numerous waves, some voluntary, some involuntary of migration. But the point is that the elite and ruling class of these tribes were slave-holding plantation owners and were motivated to keep their wealth and their slaves. And in addition, many of the elite, the tribal leaders, were not really Indian. I could go through all the tribes, which I won't, and talk about the percentage of Indian that they actually had in their blood. But for example, John Ross was only 1/8 Cherokee. He couldn't speak Cherokee. He needed a translator to talk to the council. John Ross's father was the 3rd son of an English lord. John Ross was raised as a white man. He was educated up north in universities. He looked like a white man. He dressed as a white man. His mother was 1/4 Cherokee, and since the Cherokee are matrilineal, that's why he was considered Cherokee, and he became one of the chiefs. But I'm going through all this because it directly relates to what happens in the Civil War. So the Cherokee have this really complicated history with factions going back to the 1700s. Various chiefs of the Cherokee had different opinions how to deal with the encroaching white settlers. And the factions, these different factions interacting with one another, sign a treaty, don't sign a treaty, and so forth, it all resulted in the assassination of an Indian chief named Doublehead, in case you want to know, back in 1805 or 1807, I think Doublehead was assassinated. Anyway, you need to remember this. The assassin of this chief, who was being assassinated because of a treaty he'd signed with the federal government and charges of corruption, that he was taking more of the goodies from the treaty than his group was supposed to take. Because of that, he was assassinated by, let me go back. He was assassinated by Ridge, who was not a major at the time. He was a young man. And he was the chosen assassin for this chief, Doublehead. Okay, when that happened, all of Doublehead's tribe, their group, and everyone associated with that group fled to Arkansas to prevent further killings, including Doublehead's son, known as Bird Doublehead. Just remember that. So in the meantime, after that assassination happened, the Cherokee developed a written language. They wrote a constitution. They established a democratic government. They established a printing press and a newspaper. The first newspaper was edited by a man named Elias Boudinot. He's also known as Buck Waddy, and his uncle was Ridge, Major Ridge, the assassin. So Buck Waddy, anyway, so now fast forward from that early 1800s, fast forward past to the Indian removals, and John Ross is not wanting the Indian removals to happen. He's trying to procrastinate that. At some point, Major Ridge, Buck Waddy, and other members of Major Ridge's family felt that the Cherokee would do better by moving west to the Indian Territory, especially after the Removal Act of 1830 was signed by President Andrew Jackson. And even though the United States Supreme Court had ruled in favor of the Cherokee and said they didn't have to move, President Jackson basically told the Supreme Court, Justice Marshall, you can't enforce this. And then President Jackson told John Ross, when John Ross came in about 1830, he had been negotiating all along, but about 1835, he came and Jackson told him to his face, the removal is happening. There's nothing that you can do. And it's going to happen whether you like it or not. Now, in that meeting was Major Ridge's son, John, who reported back to Ridge and said, this is not, we need to move. We're going to be moved out. And so Ridge and his son, John, other members of the Waddy family, and a few others, all signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, which gave the Cherokee tribe more than $5 million in 1835 dollars and land in Indian Territory. This was more than John Ross had ever negotiated. Okay. So here we go with what happened in the removals. And the bottom line is that removals happen. I just have to tell you this. John Ross's brother, Lewis, was given the money to do the food, the blankets, and all of that for the Indian removals. What happened to that money? We don't know, because 2,000 to 5,000 Cherokee died along the way with inadequate food, inadequate blankets, and shelter. But the federal government had given the money to John Ross to supply that, not to John Ross, to his brother Lewis. And in addition, before the removals, this might be what happened to the money, but I don't know. Lewis bought 500 black slaves and transported them successfully, by the way, to Indian Territory and resold them for a profit. So I just want you to think about all this as we go forward. So now let's go forward to, everybody arrives in the late 1830s, 1839, and Bird Doublehead, remember him, the son of the chief that had been assassinated, along with a few others, assassinated Major Ridge and every single one of the male members of his family, including Buck Waddy and all those folks. Only one escaped, a young man named Stand Waddy. Stand Waddy escaped that. And so this brings us now to the Civil War times. Again, we skip a bunch of years and now we're in Civil War, 1861. By this time, John Ross is 77 years old. He's an old man. He's now principal chief. And who has become second principal chief But you guessed it, Stand Watie. He survived the assassination, and he was representing a whole group there of the Cherokee that had now been in sort of factional conflict for decades. He represented them. So now we're in the Civil War. Stand Watie is 54, and he's basically running the tribe. At the outbreak of the war, the Confederates send a man who they all knew and trusted, a lawyer named Albert Pike, who'd won several cases for the Indians in the United States Supreme Court. They sent him to negotiate treaties with the 5 civilized tribes. He does that, except with the Cherokee, because John Ross wants to stick with the Union. Not sure why, but John Ross wants to stick with the Union. And Stand Watie says, let's go with the Confederacy. The Confederacy were promising that they would protect Indian rights. They would allow them to continue owning their slaves. By that time, the Cherokee owned 2,500 slaves. And they promised them that they could have their own Indian state, their own state. So Stand Watie accepted a commission as colonel in the Confederate State Army. He raised the 1st Regiment of Cherokee Mounted Volunteers. Reluctantly, John Ross signed on. But amazingly, 6 months later, John Ross was captured by the Union. He probably was standing in front of his house saying, "Take me." And he's captured by the Union. He fled with the Union Army to Washington, D.C., never returned again to Indian Territory. So Stand Watie takes over as chief of the tribe. That's Albert Pike. So there are 21,000 Cherokee at this time. It's the largest tribe. He immediately drafted all Cherokee males aged 18 to 50 into the Confederate military service. And a 2nd regiment of Cherokee Mounted Rifles was formed by Colonel John Drew. Their first battle was at the Battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas in March of 1862. This was their flag. Almost 1,000 mounted Indian troops were at the rear of a line. They were without uniforms. They had their own weapons. The Confederacy hadn't provided them with anything at this point. And so here they are going through the woods at the end of a Confederate line. And the Union didn't realize at this point, maybe this diagram is a little later on, but the Union didn't realize early on that the Confederates were coming through the forest. And so a group of Union forces here sort of appear and in a field. And the Indians, the Cherokee at the end of the line see them, and they come bursting out of the forest, out of the woods, with their war whoops in their own war paint and whatever. And I am here to tell you, in all accounts, the Union troops were not only surprised that there were Confederate troops here, but they were absolutely overcome that this group of 1,000 Indians is coming upon them with their tomahawks and so forth and so on. Anyway, the Watie's troops killed a lot of Union soldiers. It's said that 8 were scalped. I don't doubt that at all. They captured a Union artillery position and 3 guns. And later on, after the 2nd day of battle, they covered the retreat of the Confederate forces, because the Confederates lost this battle due to the absolute stupidity of Earl Van Dorn, who was in charge at the time. After that battle, John Drew and his group defected to the Union, and partly because of the lack of leadership from the part of General Earl Van Dorn, but partly because John Drew was the nephew of John Ross, and he really felt like he needed to be with the Union. So they went to Kansas, where they joined the Indian Home Guard. This is the split right here that solidified this Ross versus Ridge split that happened back in the 1830s. And now we have Ross versus Watie split. The 2 Indian regiments split after this battle. And it started a Cherokee Civil War in the middle of the American Civil War. And a lot of stuff that happened then with the Cherokee is because of this factional split that started way back in the early 1800s and continued to this. Okay, so just briefly, Stand Watie was a daring cavalry leader. He was skilled at hit and run tactics. He was considered a genius in guerrilla warfare. He was the most successful field commander in the Trans-Mississippi West. He reportedly fought in more skirmishes west of the Mississippi than any other unit. They fought in 18 raids and skirmishes. Their size grew to a brigade with perhaps a few thousand troops at one time. He was promoted to brigadier general in May of 1864. He was in charge of the Indian Cavalry Brigade, which included Cherokee, Creek, Osage, and Seminole. He had big success in Pleasant Bluff, Arkansas, when he captured the Union steamboat, the Williams, which was loaded with supplies that would have been valued at over $1 million today. And he had other battles where he was skirmishes and raids, where he was very successful. He was the last Confederate general to surrender in the war. He laid down arms 2 months after General Lee. But I just have to say, that's not the end of his story, all that success for the Confederacy. There's another part of the story, and that is that Stand Watie and his troops burned John Ross's house. It was a mansion called Rose Cottage to the ground. They burned the council house of the council that was now aligning with the Union, and many other buildings in Park Hill, which was outside the Cherokee capital of Tahlequah. Stand Watie's forces massacred black hay cutters at Wagoner, Oklahoma during one of their raids. The Union report said that Watie's cavalry killed all the Negroes they could find, including wounded men. I'm going to read a short paragraph from one account. This is a quote. About the 21st of May, the rebel Indians under the command of Stand Watie entered the territory where loyal Union Cherokee and other Indians lived and robbed the women and children of everything they could find. Robbing, sometimes murdering, and burning continued until the 4th day of July without abatement. That's almost 2 months. That's unquote. After another Union withdrawal left the countryside protected, Watie's group returned again to pillage and rob, mainly the women and children. Many families were forced to flee to Fort Gibson for protection. By the end of the year, more than 6,000 Indian refugees were camped within 1.5 miles of that fort. By the end of the Civil War, the Cherokee were exhausted, both by the Civil War and their fight in the American Civil War. The federal government stripped them of all their treaty rights, moved the remnants of other tribes into their territory. The black slaves of the 5 civilized tribes were freed. That's a story in and of itself. But because some of the Indian tribes ignored that order and they kept their slaves as slaves for years, the status of black people in Indian territory was really murky. They were denied rights as freed blacks because the Indians would consider them as Indians. And then the whites would deny them, the Indians would deny them rights in their territory. The whites would deny them rights because they called them Indians. I mean, it was just a mess. And I mean, it was a mess for late into the 1900s. Again, another story. Stand Watie died shortly after the war. His children had all died, his sons, and his daughters had no surviving children. So the Stand Watie line and that ridge line and all of that group that had opposed John Ross for decades, that died out. And so immediately after the war, another nephew of John Ross was elected by the Cherokee to be principal chief in 1866. He was 1/16th Cherokee. He was a graduate of Princeton University, but he was elected principal chief. And, you know, pretty much this united the tribe under the Ross leadership. So here are some reference books, and in case you're interested in learning a little bit more about this. And so if you aren't completely worn out, I'd be happy to share some questions as soon as I stop the record.